If you've ever lived out where the asphalt ends and the real world begins, you know that a fence isn't just a pile of cedar posts and high tensile wire. It's a legal document written in iron and wood that says, in quote, "This is mine, and that is yours," in quote. And most folks around here respect that like it's the gospel. But then you have people like Beatrice Vane who think a county map is just a suggestion and private property is just a scenic backdrop for their own personal kingdom. My granddad, Silas, is a man of few words and even fewer patience for people who smell like expensive cologne and entitlement. And that Tuesday morning, when the sun was just starting to bake the dew off the Timothy hay, we found a silver Cadillac Escalade parked halfway across our cattle guard, blocking the only entrance to the north pasture like it was a VIP valet spot at a country club. Granddad didn't oppose. To even swear, he just stood there on the porch with his chipped ceramic mug, the steam from his coffee mixing with the cold morning air, and he watched that SUV with a look that was somewhere between a scientist studying a bug and a judge passing a death sentence. While I was already feeling my blood pressure spike because that wasn't just any car, it had the gold leaf crest of the Blackwood Heights Homeowners Association on the door, which was funny because our ranch is about 3 miles outside their jurisdiction and 5 decades older than their stucco-in shingle McMansions. Before I could even suggest calling the sheriff, the passenger door of a white Lexus idling near the road swung open, and out stepped Beatrice herself, wearing a blazer the color of a bruised plum and carrying a clipboard like it was a shield of invincibility, marching up our gravel driveway in heels that cost more than my first truck and clicking against the stones like a countdown timer to a disaster. She didn't oppose, say good morning or ask how the calves were doing. She just pointed a manicured finger at our gate and told us that this, in quote, obstruction, in quote, was being cited for a visibility violation because the HOA's new, in quote, scenic corridor initiative, in quote, required a clear line of sight for the residents driving to the golf course. And since we hadn't oppose, T responded to the 3 emails she'd sent to an address Silas hasn't oppose. T checked since 2004. They were, in quote, officially staging, in quote, their enforcement vehicle there to document the nuisance. Silas just leaned against the porch railing, his old denim jacket stained with grease and honest work, and he asked her in that low, gravelly rumble of his if she'd noticed the 3-foot-wide yellow sign that said, in quote, danger, high voltage, in quote, or the way the air seemed to hum near the wire. But Beatrice just gave him this thin, paper-cut smile and said they'd already filed a complaint with the county about the, in quote, hazardous nature, in quote, of our fencing, and she expected it to be deactivated, while her, end quote, compliance officer, in quote, was inside the vehicle finishing the paperwork. I try to tell her that Silas doesn't oppose. T take orders from people who don't oppose. T know the difference between a bull and a heifer. But she just turned on her heel, her perfume lingering in the air like a chemical spill, and told us the SUV would move when the, end quote, documentation was complete, in quote, and not a second sooner, leaving us standing there in the quiet of the morning with a 5,000-pound piece of trespassing luxury metal kissing our hot wire. I looked at Silas, and I could see the gears turning, that slow, deliberate machinery of a man who has spent 80 years fixing what's broken and breaking what needs to be reset. And he didn't oppose. T go for his phone or a shotgun. Instead, he walked back into the barn and came out with a roll of heavy-gauge copper, a pair of insulated lineman's pliers, and a look in his eye that made me realize Beatrice Vane was about to have a very bad Tuesday. He didn't oppose. T sneak around. He just moved with that steady, legal speed pace of a man doing chores, and I watched as he expertly bridged a gap between our primary fence charger, a unit built to keep a 2,000-pound Brahman bull from wandering, and a hidden contact point on the Escalade's undercarriage, specifically the metal running board where a person's hand naturally goes when they're climbing in or out a high-cab truck. He tucked the wire into a piece of split-loom tubing, so it looked like part of the car's wiring harness, humming a little tune to himself. And when I asked him if he was worried about the legalities, he just looked at me and said that if a person chooses to park their property against a clearly marked electric fence on private land, they're essentially volunteering for a physics lesson. And Silas has always been a big believer in education. We spent the next hour sitting on the porch like we were watching a parade, Silas sipping his second cup of coffee, and me trying to hide my grin as a trail camera he'd mounted on the fence post blinked its little red eye, recording every second of the silver SUV just sitting there, soaking up enough voltage to make the air smell like ozone. The end quote, compliance officer, end quote. A guy named Daryl, who looked like he'd never spent a day out of an air-conditioned office, finally hopped out of the car to hand Beatrice a folder, and the second his boots hit the damp earth while his hand was still firmly gripped on the door handle, he did a vertical leap that would have cleared a 5-bar gate, letting out a yelp that sent a flock of crows screaming out of the oak trees. Beatrice started shrieking about, end quote, assault, end quote, and, end quote, booby traps, end quote, waving her phone around like a magic wand as she dialed the authorities, and Silas just sat there, rocking in his chair, as calm as a pond at midnight, telling her that the only thing, end quote, trapped, end quote, was a trespasser who didn't end oppose. T read the signs. By the time Sheriff Miller rolled up, followed by a tow truck Silas had called 20 minutes earlier, the scene was a full-blown circus with Beatrice pacing the gravel and Daryl refusing to touch the SUV again, claiming his teeth still felt fuzzy, and the sheriff, who has known Silas since the days of one-room schoolhouses, just took one look at the Escalade parked 3 feet onto our property line and sighed the sigh of a man who is tired of city people bringing city problems to the country. Beatrice went into a rehearsed monologue about HOA easements and, end quote, community safety, end quote, but Miller just tapped the, end quote, private property, end quote, sign with his flashlight and asked her if she had a deed or a court order, and when she started stammering about, end quote, implied consent for scenic beauty, end quote, he just shook his head and told the tow driver to, end quote, hook the damn thing up, end quote, because it was an unauthorized vehicle on a working ranch. The Real kicker came when the county inspector arrived an hour later, called by Beatrice in a desperate attempt to get Silas fined into oblivion, but the inspector's meter showed that the fence was pulsing at a perfectly legal, albeit very high, agricultural setting, and since the, end quote, connection, end quote, to the car was technically caused by the car being parked against the fence line, there was an end oppose. TA thing they could do to Silas except ask him to move his wire back to the post once the, end quote, debris, end quote, was towed away. As the Escalade was dragged off towards the impound lot with its alarm blaring a pathetic, high-pitched rhythm, Silas finally stood up and walked down to the gate, looking Beatrice right in those expensive sunglasses of hers and telling her that while she might own the ridge and the houses on it, the dirt under his boots was bought with blood and sweat, and he didn't oppose. T rent his integrity to people who used, end quote, community, end quote, as a weapon to bully their neighbors. A few days later, word got back to us through the local grapevine that the Blackwood Heights Board had gone into an emergency session because it turned out Beatrice had never actually gotten approval for her, end quote, scenic corridor, end quote, project, and the Escalade wasn't an oppose, even an HOA vehicle. It was a personal lease she'd been trying to write off as a business expense, and the, end quote, compliance officer, end quote, Daryl was actually her nephew who was supposed to be working at a car wash. The whole thing imploded like a barn in a tornado, with the treasurer filing an audit that revealed a gold-plated paper trail of, end quote, administrative fees, end quote, that had been disappearing into Beatrice's private accounts. And suddenly the woman who wanted to regulate our gate and oppose visibility was too busy trying to find a lawyer who didn't end oppose. T charged $500 an hour to worry about our cattle. Nate, the taller guy who'd been with him that morning, actually came by the ranch a week later without his vest or his clipboard, looking a lot humbler, and he sat on the edge of the porch and apologized, telling us that Lydia, sorry, Beatrice, had a way of making people feel like they were part of something important when they were really just part of a grudge. And Silas just handed him a glass of iced tea and told him that a man's character is like a fence. If you don and oppose, T maintain the posts. The whole thing eventually falls over. We still see Beatrice's car on the highway now and then, but she doesn't in oppose. T stop anymore. She doesn't in oppose. T look our way, and she certainly doesn't in oppose. T park on our gravel, because some people learn by reading the signs, and some people have to feel the spark before they understand where the boundary is. I've lived here my whole life, and I've seen a lot of things change, the orchards turning into subdivisions and the quiet nights getting louder. And I've learned that as long as you keep your facts straight and your fence hot, the truth has a way of coming out in the wash. My granddad is a legend in the county now, not because he, end quote, won, end quote, a fight, but because he reminded everyone that, in quote, neighborly, in quote, is a two-way street, and just because you have a blazer and a clipboard doesn't in oppos mean you get to own the horizon. So I'm curious, do you think Silas went too far by, in quote, wiring, in quote, that SUV, or was it the only language a person like Beatrice was ever going to understand? Have you ever had an HOA or a neighbor try to tell you what to do on your own land? And how did you draw the line? Drop a comment below and let me know if you're a, in quote, muffins and meetings, in quote, kind of person, or if you prefer a fence that hums.